Hey, Animal Allies, I'm Michelle. Welcome to another episode of the Animal Liberation Hour, where we seek insight from animal rights activists to inspire us to fight for animals worldwide. My guest on this pod is Jeff Sebo, author of The Moral Circle. A little bit about Animal Activism Collective. AAC was created to galvanize activists by equipping them with the tools, community, and resources they need to boldly participate in our global animal liberation movement. Our core goal is to eradicate the normalization of violence and oppression against all sentient beings by growing a culture of empathy and compassion. We do this through mentorship, education, support, and multi-pronged activism. Please visit our website and follow us on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook, and reach out to us to apply to become a mentor or mentee. So now to our guest. Jeff Sebo is a philosopher and animal rights activist. He works at New York University, where he is an associate professor of environmental studies and an affiliated professor of bioethics, medical ethics, philosophy, and law. He is director of the university's Center for Environmental and Animal Protection, director of the university's Center for Mine Ethics and Policy, and co-director of the university's Wild Animal Welfare Program. In 2022, he published his first book, Saving Animals, Saving Ourselves. This was followed in 2025 by The Moral Circle, Who Matters, What Matters, and Why. Our in-depth conversation covers human exceptionalism, why widening our moral circle is imperative, and why we must give moral consideration to insects and bugs. Please enjoy my conversation with Jeff Sebo. Hey, Jeff, welcome to the Animal Liberation Hour.
Hi, Michelle. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so you are a philosopher and an author. In your new book, right here, The Moral Circle, Who Matters, What Matters, and Why, you call for a revolution in ethics, suggesting we expand our moral circle to all animals, including insects. I'm on board. As well as AI systems and even microbes, etc. So we're going to dive into your philosophy to see where morality and ethics interact with animal rights activism, because mostly listening here, we have animal rights activists and they want to know more. So
Yeah, great.
My first question then is to all my guests is, what is your animal advocate origin story? In other words, when and why did you start speaking up for animals?
My origin story is when I was a college student. I was a philosophy and sociology student at Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, Texas. And when I started, I was an ordinary American teenager. I ate meat and dairy and eggs, and I had companion animals growing up, but otherwise, well, in addition to that, had standard attitudes and dispositions regarding animals of various kinds. But I started taking philosophy and sociology classes, and in the philosophy classes, we read Singer and Regan and all kinds of other authors who were challenging our interactions with animals from an ethical perspective. And in my sociology classes, I was reading debunking explanations of why we have the attitudes we have about animals. And that was persuasive for me. I was compelled to reject the beliefs and values that I previously had about animals, grudgingly accepted that I should go vegetarian and eventually vegan. And in the back half of my time at college, I was becoming more involved in advocacy of various kinds and thinking about where I wanted to focus my attention. And I realized that of all of the issues that I cared about, and of course there were many, animal advocacy was the one that was most neglected on campus, the one issue where there were no student organizations, no organized student activity of any kind. And so I started a couple of animal protection, animal rights organizations on campus. And that was a really valuable experience for me. We did local fundraising, we did local organizing, leafleting campaigns, etc. and and that helped me to get a little bit of experience and a little bit of perspective about local advocacy. And then I carried that with me into graduate school. And as I became an academic, I started to learn how I could use my platform as an academic through my research and my teaching and my service and engagement with nonprofit organizations to do different kinds of advocacy. So yeah, that was where it started though.
Very cool. Very good story. I love hearing that. So fast forward then, like, why do you consider yourself mainly a philosopher? And like, why writing? Why has writing become your main platform for your message?
Well, I am a philosopher because I studied philosophy in college and I then got a PhD in philosophy, and I now am a practicing philosopher, though I practice my philosophy in an environmental studies department with an animal studies program. So my work is more interdisciplinary these days. I pursued philosophy because I was really captivated by it in college. I did study other fields, including sociology, but philosophy was where I had the opportunity to really both understand and then interrogate my most deeply held beliefs and values and practices and make them more informed and more coherent so I could live an examined and authentic life that really reflects what I most deeply care about. And that was a really important, formative, gratifying experience for me, but it was also not done by the time I graduated from college. So I pursued a PhD both because I wanted to continue to investigate these issues and improve my own beliefs and values and practices, but also because I at that point was really persuaded that philosophy is both useful for that reason and
Yeah.
useful for education and advocacy. And so that was why that became my center of gravity as an academic. As far as research is concerned, I think research and writing are really useful tools both for clarifying my own ideas for myself, but then also sharing them with colleagues, sharing them with policymakers, sharing them with the general public. And I do have a platform as an academic where I can contribute to research, to advancing knowledge, but then also I can contribute to the social discourse, and I can take
Yeah.
our evidence, I can take our ideas, and I can write about them in a newspaper or a magazine or an online publication in a way that reaches a wider audience and maybe can influence policy sometimes. This is, of course, a little bit of a crapshoot. Though I will say research and writing are only one way that we do that work. We also do it through outreach, through organizing events and other forms of public engagement, and through field building activities, and through coordination, consultation for nonprofit organizations or policymakers. So we try to do our kind of work in different ways and then allow ourselves to be pleasantly surprised when some kind of effort ends up making some kind of difference.
Yeah, absolutely. We all have our role to play in this movement, and you've definitely found yours. And I love what you're saying. It just broadens your reach and establishes credibility right out of the gate, which gives you more opportunities to talk about what you talk about in the books. And philosophy in general is just this pursuit of knowledge, pursuit of answers, but what you find out is it just leads to more questions, more questions, and there's just never-ending questions. And I'm
Yeah.
very curious about all of sort of the underlying premises, but also I know we're going to talk about applying that practically
Hmm.
and day to day and hands-on for
Hmm.
animals. So, but from your book, what is the moral circle as a general ethic or principle?
The moral circle is our conception of the scope of the moral community, who belongs in the moral community. In other words, to whom are we accountable? To whom do we have responsibilities for their own sakes? And this is important to consider because, of course, for most of human history, especially in the West, we have had a very narrow conception of the moral circle, as everybody listening to this podcast will appreciate. We have tended to extend moral consideration to, at most, select humans, maybe the occasional companion animal. But we now realize, or at least many of us realize, that we should be extending moral consideration to many more individuals, at the very least, all humans and many animals, like mammals and birds, affected by our activities. But as we work to live up to at least that standard, we have an opportunity to ask, should we go even farther? And if so, how far should we go and what should the details be and what should follow for our actions and our policies and our priorities and the goals and strategies that, for example, activists and advocates select. So that is what this book is about.
Yeah. So say a little bit more, I guess, why, for our listeners, why it's important to expand our moral circle. Why do we want to widen our moral considerations to others who have been left out? In other words, why does it matter? Because would you agree? Generally, people are so self-absorbed in their own lives. They just want to know what's in it for me, right? So how do you answer that question when you're talking about expanding the moral circle? Like, and they say, well, what's in it for me?
Yes, and I agree. We all definitely have self-interested motivations. I think we also have altruistic motivations, and usually our actions, our decisions result from some combination of self-interest and altruism. And a lot of time people want to treat animals better, but they feel trapped in certain social, legal, political, economic arrangements where the incentives for maintaining the status quo are really strong and the incentives for deviating are not so strong. And so they wish it was easier to treat animals well. They wish it was easier to go vegan. They wish it was easier to have alternatives to animal research, but they want to maintain the status quo given how hard those alternatives are. So I think that is sad and unfortunate, but it also points in a direction of how we can make progress. We can both do education and advocacy and change hearts and minds and change incentive structures so that making the right choice is easier. But to your question, why does it matter to talk about the moral circle as we do that work of education and advocacy and changing incentives? Because even though we still have a lot of work to do for our fellow humans and mammals and birds, these animals who are now by and large presumed to be sentient and deserving of at least some moral concern, it matters that we bring other animals and other potentially sentient, morally significant beings into that conversation, because unless we do that, well-intentioned people might end up advocating for the wrong kinds of policy changes, the wrong kinds of farming substitutions. For example, a lot of people right now are advocating for fish farming or even insect farming as sustainable alternatives to traditional terrestrial animal agriculture. And so unless you actively bring fishes into your conception of the moral circle, even insects into your conception of the moral circle, there is a real risk that instead of transitioning from, say, cow and pig and chicken farming to plant and fungus farming, that people instead will advocate for transitioning to more fish farming or more insect farming in a way that, yes, might be better for the environment in some respects, but is also bad for the environment in other respects, and importantly, even worse for animal welfare in expectation, given the evidence currently available to us. So we have to think about this holistically, thinking about animal welfare, public health, and the environment at the same time, and thinking about all animals who either are or at least might be sentient, given the evidence currently available, in order to guard against making those kinds of mistakes.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for framing it that way, that otherwise we're creating systems blindly, or we're creating systems on old or incorrect assumptions. That's why it matters. But in our audience, we probably have people, most everybody understands what sentience is, but could you define sentience, talk about sentience as a precursor to moral standing, or how do consciousness, or I know consciousness and sentience are related, but they're still different. So if you can distinguish, how do consciousness and sentience relate to moral consideration, and how can we evolve beyond our collective limiting beliefs?
Yes, there are, of course, different theories of moral standing, of what it takes to matter morally for your own sake, what it takes to deserve moral consideration for your own sake. Sentience and or consciousness are one of the leading kind of bundles of theories. And so to answer your question about that bundle of theory in particular, sentience is defined as the ability to consciously experience positive and negative states like pleasure, pain, happiness, suffering, satisfaction, and frustration. So if you have consciousness, in other words, if it feels like something to be you, if you can have subjective experiences of various kinds, and if you can have valence, in other words, if there can be positive and negative conscious experiences that feel good or bad to you in one way or another, then you count as sentient. And so that might be a matter of bodily pleasures and pains. It could also be a matter of emotional happiness or suffering. It could also be a matter of emotional hope or fear. As long as you have experiences that feel good or bad in one way or another, then you count as both conscious and sentient. And the reason this is often thought to be the basis of moral standing is that once you have consciousness and sentience, once you can have subjective experiences that feel good or bad to you, then it matters to you what happens to you. You have a personal individual stake in what happens to you. For example, why is kicking a mouse down the street for fun wrong? On this view, arguably, that is wrong because it hurts the mouse. It feels bad to be a mouse being kicked down the street. And you ought to take that into account when making decisions about how to treat the mouse.
It's kind of crazy to think that we have to remind people that the animal's point of view matters. Oh my gosh, matters first and foremost. It's so
Yeah.
crazy. And, of course, to ask, does what happens to them matter to them?
Right.
Yeah, that's like a Captain Obvious kind of observation, but nonetheless, here we are. So you use a term in the book, and I want you to expand on it, which is human exceptionalism.
Hmm.
And I think it's been said other different ways have been coined as well, but why is what is it? And why is human exceptionalism the norm? And how does that lead to using, abusing, wearing, and consuming animals unnecessarily every single day? Because everybody's doing it.
Yes. So human exceptionalism, exactly as you say, is defined in different ways by different people. For my purposes and my work in this book, I define it specifically as this tendency to presume that humans always matter most and always take priority. And so many people do care about animals and they do want to improve treatment of animals, but they insist that humans come first. And so we should, on this view, improve our treatment of animals to the extent that this is compatible with doing the most we can for humanity. But we should never allow any trade-offs between human and animal health and welfare. We should never make even minor sacrifices on behalf of humanity in order to secure major gains, major progress for other animals. This is human exceptionalism. And what I point out in the book, and really argue at length in the book, is that there are various arguments for human exceptionalism that are reasonable enough, but that do not justify anything like our current degree of prioritization for our species and instrumentalization and objectification of other species. There might be some good reasons to prioritize our species to some extent in the same kind of way that there are some good reasons to prioritize our individual families over others to some extent. But we should not blithely harm and kill and neglect non-humans in the course of prioritizing our species in the same way that I would never do that to other families in the course of prioritizing my own family. And so I think the right balanced kind of attitude involves, yes, continuing to safeguard a future for our species and improve human lives and societies, while very significantly improving our treatment of non-human animals here and now. And then as we do make progress as a species and we have more capacity for altruism over time, then our responsibility to care for animals will increase accordingly. And if we ever reach the point as a species where we have so much capacity that we could achieve and sustain a higher level of support for non-humans than we need for ourselves, then at that point, we should actually prioritize other species over ourselves in a way that can be achieved and sustained. So we should work towards a future where we can and should and do literally prioritize non-humans over ourselves and kind of reimagine ourselves as stewards of the planet here primarily in service of other animals.
Yeah. I mean, we're there. We could technically actually do that now if it weren't for this mindset that is so pervasive and ubiquitous and invisible notion and mindset that animals are less than us. So, yeah, that's the stuff that makes us shake our heads. But so let's talk about like what is the moral circle as a daily
Mhm,
practice in
mhm.
real time, real world applications. How does it show up in the day to day? And how can we as animal advocates bring the awareness of that into our choices and actions and speaking?
Mhm. Very practically, it shows up in the day-to-day in terms of who is considered when we make decisions and when we select policies. And then how is that reflected in many of our other behaviors and patterns of thinking and talking? So, for example, in policy contexts, of course, only humans are understood to have legal personhood, to, in a very deep sense, be subjects of concern in our legal system. There are animal welfare policies. Now, these tend to have a lot of carve outs for animals who are used for food or for research, and for vertebrates instead of invertebrates, and so on and so forth. And so that shows you in a very practical sense how our legal and political system understands the scope of the moral and the legal and political circle. It includes humans, it includes some vertebrates, especially companion animals and other vertebrates, but not necessarily farmed or lab animals all the time, not necessarily invertebrates. And so these gaps in our formal mechanisms for considering the interests of other beings when making decisions that affect them give you a sense of how it plays out in practice. But then that also is reflected in our own ways of thinking and feeling and acting. For example, you might default, not you individually, Michelle, but one might default to using he or she or they to describe a cat or dog or companion animal, but then default to it to describe a farmed animal or a wild animal who is not seen as having an individual personality and their own morally significant interests. And certainly for insects, I think for many people it would be very foreign to look at an individual ant and think of them as a they. And I think this tells us something about our tendency to view certain beings as subjects with their own minds and lives and personalities and interests, and other beings as objects without those types of properties, or at least not seeing that as readily. And so what I hope we can do is correct that by having a more consistent and inclusive approach, not only to representation of other minds and lives in our policies, but even in our patterns of thought and talking and behavior in our own individual lives.
And that we can control. Everybody can right now, today, begin to be more aware of what you're thinking, the discrimination in your thinking or the blind spots in your thinking, as well as how you're speaking about animals. That's a really great place to start. I'm glad you said like you're hopeful, or we hope, because that's what I wanted to ask you. How
Yeah.
hopeful are you that specifically that sort of the legal aspect might change in our lifetime, in the idea that what you're saying, because animals are someone, not something, but in the eyes of the law, they are things, possessions, objects. You talk about Happy the elephant in your book. You don't have to go
Right.
into the whole story of that. I want people to read it. And so how hopeful are you that maybe in our lifetime animals will be considered persons, or right, or their own?
Yeah, I am generally cautiously hopeful that we can make progress within our own lifetime, certainly on animal welfare protections, but then possibly even for animal personhood and this more fundamental kind of legal status. So you mentioned Happy the elephant. Without going into a lot of detail, I can note that Happy is part of a journey that our legal system is taking right now, where, for example, in 2017, 2018, there was a legal case involving Kiko and Tommy, two captive chimpanzees. The Non-Human Rights Project brought a case to the New York Court of Appeals saying, will you consider habeas corpus for these two animals, which presumes legal personhood and rights, at least a right to bodily liberty? And the New York Court of Appeals said, nope, not going to consider it. But one judge did write an opinion saying, while we are not considering it, the arguments are good. This does seem to be an injustice that we will have to reckon with. That was an important moment. Then came Happy the elephant. This time, the Non-Human Rights Project once again brought a case on behalf of Happy the elephant to the New York Court of Appeals with the same kind of argument, the same kind of justification. And this time, they took the case and they heard the case. And it was the first time in the history of the world that the highest court in an English-speaking jurisdiction heard such a case. Now, they voted against Happy and in favor of the Bronx Zoo in a 5-2 decision, but there were two powerful dissenting opinions written by judges that will now be part of the legal literature and represent incremental progress. So I do think that there can be further such incremental progress, and one brave court at some point in our lifetimes that are willing to say, yes, this one animal has this one right. And I recognize that will raise a lot of questions for other animals and other rights. We will have to reckon with those together as a society. But I am here saying that at least this one animal has at least this one right. I think that we plausibly could see that within our lifetimes. And I want to work very hard to see how much progress we can make in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what we do as animal activists and advocates is lay the groundwork for the future, for future generations, for others who will pick up the baton and continue this work for animals. But yeah, just as you know, what you're saying, it gets the conversation on record, at least, at the very least now. And you're right, if they said yes, if they vote, I like how you said they voted against Happy. That is like makes it even more sad when you know, instead of voting for Happy. And Happy's not happy. And Happy's been in, is it the Bronx Zoo then for 30,
The
40 years?
Bronx
And you were
Zoo.
trying to get her sent to a sanctuary.
Yes, the call was for Happy to be recognized as a legal person with, at the very least, a right to bodily liberty. And then, in recognition of her bodily liberty, for Happy to be relocated to a sanctuary where she could live with other elephants and have her needs met more than they are in her enclosure at the Bronx Zoo.
She's still there.
I am not familiar with her current state. I know that
Okay.
there has been curiosity about why she has been appearing in public less frequently. I am not sure what the current status of that is.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to give our listeners a moment. Just take a moment and think about Happy and all animals in cages and enclosures and in tanks right now from their point of view, just to keep that sort of empathy front and center for them. So in the book, you say that if we assert that beings might matter, we should assume they do. And if we might be negatively affecting any being, we should assume we are. Like that's philosophical logic. If this, then that, it makes sense.
Yeah.
But talk a bit about that.
Yeah, this I think is really crucial for everything you and I have been discussing. Part of what has inhibited progress is that people have set a very high standard for expanding the moral circle, for including more beings within the moral community. And the very high standard is we need to be certain, or at least confident, that they are sentient or otherwise morally significant. But that is an unreasonable standard because we have persistent, ongoing disagreement and uncertainty about what it takes to matter and about which kinds of beings can be sentient and conscious and otherwise morally significant. And so if you require certainty or confidence about sentience and consciousness and moral significance before you start considering your effects on someone, then that is a recipe for delaying moral consideration for a being who very well might be morally significant and have interests and needs and vulnerabilities of their own. And this is not a very esoteric philosophical point. This is a very familiar practical policy point. We routinely consider risk when making high stakes policy decisions. When policymakers are making decisions concerning public health, they consider an uncertain, even low risk of a future pandemic. When they make decisions concerning the environment, they consider an uncertain, even low risk of catastrophic climate change. Even in our own personal lives, when we make decisions about our health, about whether to take a new medicine that has a 1 in 10,000 chance of producing a fatal side effect, we consider that risk. Now, some risks are worth taking. Maybe I do take the medicine, but I at least consider the risk. And my point is, even if I am not certain if an animal is sentient or conscious, even if I am not confident that an animal is sentient and conscious, as long as the evidence supports at least a realistic, non-negligible, non-trivial possibility that the animal can suffer, can feel pain, I ought to take that into account as at least one factor among many in decisions about how to treat that animal. And right now, the evidence does support at least a realistic, non-negligible, non-trivial possibility of sentience and consciousness and moral significance in all vertebrates, mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fishes, and many invertebrates. Cephalopod mollusks like octopuses, decapod crustaceans like lobsters, even insects like ants and bees. And so my argument is that we should not wait for certainty or even confidence about other minds that may or may not ever arrive before taking action. When there is a realistic possibility of harm, that constitutes a risk that we have a responsibility to consider, and we should start considering those risks today.
And that's a really nice segue into talking a little bit about insects.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, let's our insect friends as an example for that. I find so fascinating the insect
Mm-hmm.
community, kingdom that, because they're so disregarded because they're tiny in
Yeah.
comparison to us. But so, and clear this up for me, because when I've Googled how many individual insects are alive on Earth, it says 10 quintillion, but I think you
Yeah.
talk about sextillion. And these are numbers
Yeah.
that nobody ever talks about because we cannot fathom. There's nothing at that
Right.
scope and scale besides insects. So that's more than 1 billion, is that right? For every human. So they
Mm-hmm.
far outnumber every other species, yet insects are at the bottom or outside of the moral consideration circle.
Mm-hmm.
They're entirely brushed off as deserving of their own lives. They are invisible. Humans believe they are superior to insects, such that they are exterminated in mass, but they're sentient and they are organized communities, yes, or societies. They have hierarchies. They interact with each other. So talk about what you say in the book and in your philosophy about giving moral consideration to insects and bugs and why it's so important, where it fits in your philosophy.
Yeah, so I first of all just want to emphasize everything you just said because I think that was all right on the money. We do share the world with more than 1 million species of insects, probably significantly more, and then more than a quintillion insects alive at any given time, possibly an order of magnitude more than that. These estimates are, of course, very speculative. They go back a long way. But yeah, there could be anywhere from 1 to 10 quintillion insects alive at any given time. And that is, to be clear, more than quadrillion, certainly more than trillion, certainly more than billion. So 1 to 10 quintillion is a lot of individuals. Now, the reason I talk about sextillions in the book is because I think our actions and policies affect not only all of the insects alive now, but also future generations of insects. And so we have to consider not only the present effects on existing beings, but also the near future effects on their descendants or the lack of descendants, depending on how our policies affect them. And that is where the numbers really skyrocket even more. But to answer your question about insects directly, obviously, when there are more than 1 million species and more than a quintillion individuals, our evidence about them is very gappy, very incomplete, and mixed. We have some evidence that supports sentience, other evidence that supports non-sentience, but the evidence is such that there is certainly a realistic possibility of sentience for the insects about whom we do have more evidence, like bees, for example. And we can make an inference based on that about many of the other insects, at least in their adult stage, and presume a realistic possibility of sentience for the population of adult insects as we seek further evidence. But as you say, we have a host of biases and heuristics that lead us to look the other way. First of all, we have a bias in favor of animals who are like us. So large heads, large bodies, large eyes, furry instead of scaly skin, symmetrical instead of asymmetrical features. And then, of course, we also have a bias in favor of animals who are seen as companions instead of animals who are seen as commodities or as pests or invasive species. And insects are, of course, often seen as pests or invasive species. We also have scope insensitivity. This is an inability to appreciate the significance of large numbers. So we are much more moved by a story of a charismatic animal, a single individual charismatic animal, than we are by abstract statistics about how our policies affect quadrillions of insects through agricultural insecticides, for example. So all of these biases and heuristics conspire to make us basically discount or entirely neglect our effects on insects, even though in the aggregate, there could just be a calamitous amount of pain and suffering caused by our actions and policies for the insect population.
Yeah, again, circling back to the animals, to their experiences, to their point of view across the board. Of course, if they're sentient, they feel and they're aware and they suffer and they feel pain. So even for, our wonderful vegans and animal activists, this can be a blind spot, out they forget. They forget about that. So,
Hmm.
you're right. I think there's this unconscious thing where we subjectively see some animals as cute because
Hmm.
they look more like us. We relate to them, and insects look more alien, or what we think aliens potentially look like. So,
Yeah,
like, how
yeah.
can vegans and animal advocates change our thinking even more about insects and bugs and help them daily, like advocate for them?
Yeah, I think that it is harder to advocate for insects than for cows and pigs and chickens and fishes even. And of course, as vegan animal activists know, even advocating for cows and pigs and chickens and fishes is quite difficult at the present moment. But I think first of all, a good step for us is to think about how we might ourselves have a certain kind of defensiveness or resistance around this, and to work on that, because
Mm,
then that can also help us to diffuse that with other people. So for example, a lot of vegans might, or animal activists might, have a knee-jerk reaction of the following form: why should we advocate for insects right now when we still have so much progress to make for the mammals and the birds?
mm,
Why are we jumping the gun? But of course, this is not so different from what other people say to vegans when they say, why are we advocating for the cows and the pigs and the chickens and the fishes when we still have so much progress to make for humans? And of course, the answer there is, well, we can and should do both at the same time. And we should search for ways forward that can be robustly good for humans and animals and the environment all at the same time, right? We don't have to treat this as a negative sum, zero sum situation. We can find both and positive sum solutions. And I think we can take that same approach in our own thinking about insects and our own advocacy for insects. We are not ready as a species to make sacrifices for humanity in order to improve insect welfare. But if we at least include insects in the conversation, we might once again be able to find co-beneficial positive sum solutions that are good for humans and vertebrate non-humans and invertebrate non-humans at the same time. And that can just be win-win-win across the board. And if we start there, that could be a way of still making progress for humans and cows and pigs and chickens and fishes, but then also making progress for insects while normalizing the idea of including insects as stakeholders in our policy decisions. And then as we normalize that idea and as we build up a kind of institutional infrastructure for considering the interests of insects and understanding the interests of insects, then in the future, we might be able to go farther and make better decisions and really center their interests more than we can do right now.
yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you did that, and you're debunking that whole line of questioning, the why should we care line of questioning, as a little
Hmm.
bit of catching vegans sometimes in a gotcha moment of hypocrisy, that you don't, and of course, caring people care about all species. And we want to see a better world for all earthlings, of course. And we can't
Hmm.
walk and chew gum at the same time and care for more than one cause, more than one species, and act in that direction. So I
Yep.
think that also leads us to my next question as well. It's a good segue. So talk about why you say we must also give more consideration to AI systems and
Hmm.
microbes.
Yeah.
What? So is that what you're proposing? Maybe I might be simplifying it. Now we're on the leading edge of very new thought here. These are things not talked about in the animal rights realm.
Right.
Why is this a blind spot for animal rights activists, and how does it tie in?
Yeah. So I think the AI system question is a little bit more urgent than the microbe question, though I think in the fullness of time we should consider plants, fungi, microscopic organisms as sentient consciousness, or at least moral significance candidates. And here too, vegan and animal activists are going to have their defensiveness up because, of course, we recognize that people will sometimes say, what about plants, as a gotcha accusation against vegans. And we can be tempted to reject it for that reason. But it may just be that there is interesting evidence that favors sentience or consciousness or moral significance for plants and fungi. And if that turned out to be true, then we should be prepared to recognize that and really reckon with what it means for our food system and our ways of navigating the world. But in any case, to answer your question about AI, there really is active debate among experts, among policymakers, among the general public about how we should coexist with increasingly powerful AI. And right now, a lot of that conversation is understandably about AI safety. How can we make AI systems safe and beneficial for humans and other animals? But I argue, and many of my colleagues also argue, that conversation should also include consideration of AI welfare. How can we make AI safe and beneficial for AI systems themselves if and when they acquire their own version of sentience and consciousness? Now, that might seem like science fiction now, or it might seem like a problem only for the distant future now, because we know, yes, chatbots, large language models, they might be impressive, they might talk as though they have consciousness, but we know that their language outputs are a result of pattern recognition and text prediction and not an actual reflection of their beliefs and values. But part of what is concerning is that AI companies and governments are racing towards the creation of increasingly sophisticated AI systems. And they are right now working on giving AI systems advanced and integrated capacities for their own version of perception and attention and learning and memory and self-awareness and flexible decision-making and a kind of global workspace that coordinates activity across these modules. So in the near future, when you are talking with your Roomba or a robot or a chatbot in your life, now they may be talking to you not merely because of pattern recognition and text prediction, but actually because they have cognitive states that resemble beliefs and values and intentions and memories and anticipations and so on. And at that point, the main difference between us and them might just be that we are made out of carbon-based cells and a product of evolution, and they are made out of silicon-based chips and a product of science. But we got to ask, how much depends on that? Does that really determine who counts as sentient and morally significant? And I think we are going to face those questions in the next 5 and 10 years, and we have got to start preparing to face those questions thoughtfully now. Otherwise, we could end up getting caught flat-footed and just responding in a reactive, haphazard way, and that will not be good for anyone.
Very interesting. Very, very interesting. That's why all of this is such great leading edge thought to really consider. And since you have your future goggles on right now, you're taking out your crystal ball for whatever it's worth. So what does the future on Earth potentially look like if we don't expand our moral circle? Are we going to just dystopia will become reality? And what does it potentially look like if we do? And I don't know, are we at a crisis point now? Or are we at a tipping point?
Well, we certainly are at a crisis point now. The only question is how much worse the present crises will get and how many new crises will join them. We know from the past 50 years that neglect of non-human health and welfare can be catastrophic. We, of course, very gradually scaled up factory farming, and now factory farming and industrial animal agriculture are entrenched in our global economy. And when we started scaling up factory farming and industrial animal agriculture, experts in the general public were more skeptical that even cows and pigs and chickens and fishes are sentient, conscious, morally significant. Of course, we now appreciate that they are. We also appreciate that these food systems cause an incredible amount of harm to public health and the environment. But now that we realize that industrial animal agriculture is harmful in these ways, we have scaled it up to the point that it is globally entrenched, and it will take decades to dismantle it, even if we start actively working towards dismantling it right now. And so as we work to really internalize that lesson and try to advocate for dismantling industrial animal agriculture, we can see that these new animal use industries are coming online, and some of them concern other animals who are understood to be within the moral circle, like xenotransplantation is a new form of animal research and the harvesting of organs, but then also invertebrate farming, particularly insect farming, as a form of food production for humans, food production for companion and farmed animals, and waste management practice. And now the development and deployment and scaling of AI systems. And once again, we are at risk of just repeating this mistake of casually scaling up these new animal use industries like insect farming and non-human use industries like AI development because of our skepticism that these beings are sentient and morally significant. Then in the fullness of time, we might realize that the evidence is stronger than we appreciated. But then at that point, so much damage will have already been done. The industries will be globally entrenched, much more difficult to dislodge. And so as we work to undo the damage of industrial animal agriculture, I would like to think ahead this time about whether we are at risk of repeating that mistake, and see if we might be able to move on to a different track. So it is an urgent situation in those respects.
Yeah, we should act as if the barn is on fire right now and not wait. And that's, that's what activism is. It's getting active, it's action oriented. And so, with that, you say, think cosmically, act globally, and act locally.
Yeah.
So what do you mean by that? How can we translate this into action?
Yeah, we have this old idea that comes from social justice and environmental spaces that a good approach to making change in the world is to think globally and act locally. So to think about where we would like the world to head, and then think about what we can do in our own local community and local environment to be or represent the change that we wish to seek in the world. And I think that makes a lot of sense because not all of us are able to all the time be actors on the global stage. So sometimes when we are positioned to be actors on the global stage, we should, of course, consider it all and represent the interests of all. But sometimes we need to think globally in order to understand where we think we should generally be heading, and then act locally in the sense of playing our own role in that division of labor and trying to make our own version of that progress in our community while hoping that others are doing the same in their communities and that we can all be working together. And my point at the end of the book is that this is still a good pattern of thought, but we do now live in the Anthropocene, in a geological epoch defined by the effects of human activity on the planet. And so the scales of our impacts just are increasing across the board. We now are at risk not only of having effects on our own planet, but having effects on other planets. People are actively discussing colonizing other planets, or even terraforming other planets and bringing life to other planets. And once we make those decisions, then we just will be responsible for all of the good and bad that happens to that life on those planets. And my suggestion is that we maintain this idea that we think at larger scales and then act at smaller scales. But the scales might need to be increasing across the board. We might need to start thinking cosmically about how our actions affect sentient life, not only at home, but also abroad on other planets. And then we might start to act more globally because our actions just are having a wider reach. Even our own individual or local actions are having a wider reach now. So we just really have to take that into account and take into account the interests of distant others, individuals whom we affect across space and across time, even when making our own local individual decisions.
Mm. Awesome. It just reminds us of how we're responsible. I mean, how each of us want to step into the responsibility. And it almost sounds like I hear people feeling like a little overwhelmed
Yeah.
too. I don't know if you if you can help them address the overwhelm, or that's just
Yeah.
for another conversation for another day.
No, I think this is a really essential part of this conversation, and so I appreciate your asking about it. I of course feel overwhelmed too, and as I note both at the start and the end, and really throughout the book, I think that a key to addressing these issues thoughtfully is to start by really accepting the importance and the difficulty of these issues in equal measure, and really accepting our responsibilities as well as our limitations in equal measure, because it can be tempting to recognize that these issues are really important. Our effects on all these non-humans are really important, and then downplay the difficulty because we want to think we have the power to do what we need to do, or vice versa, to appreciate the difficulty, but then downplay the importance because it sucks to think that we might not be able to do what we need to do, right? But I think both of those ways of resolving that cognitive tension are really bad because it just is really important and we do have really weighty responsibilities, but it also is really difficult and we do have profound limitations. We lack the knowledge about what these non-humans need. We lack the capacity to provide it for them sustainably, and we lack the political will to provide it for them sustainably. So I think that when we really sit with our overwhelm and think about the importance and our responsibilities, but also the difficulty and our limitations, that guides us towards a kind of gradual, incremental, intergenerational theory of change, where we do have these radical aspirational goals for the long-term future in terms of having a just, equitable, multi-species society. But we have a thoughtful, strategic, achievable, sustainable, tractable way of making progress towards that goal. So for food system reform, yes, we should eventually end and ban industrial animal agriculture, but we start by advocating for informational policies that educate the public, by supporting financial policies that shift subsidies and other financial incentives, by supporting regulatory policies that ban the worst excesses of factory farming, by supporting just transition policies that can support farmers and workers in making transitions to other types of agriculture. And similarly with wild animals, we might eventually want a world where we can take care of wild animals and protect them from the harms caused by human activity at vast scales. But we might need to start by supporting very concrete, specific policies like bird-safe glass on new buildings and overpasses and underpasses on new roads. And so the reason I offer this as a response to the overwhelm is that even if we have a lot of work to do and it will take generations to do it, we can still start right now by pursuing tractable, robustly good for humans and animals and the environment interventions for farmed animals and for wild animals. And that is achievable and that is sustainable. It can build momentum and it can be our role in that intergenerational division of labor. And if we play our role well, then our successors will be able to go a little bit farther thanks to our work. And I think that should be the solution as opposed to just getting overwhelmed and not wanting to do any of it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Action is the antidote in that way. And that's, you know, keeping our conversation for another moment in the present moment, the work you're currently doing, and maybe, I don't know if you have any calls for action, but you could say a bit right now. I know you're heavily involved in animal advocacy in so many different forums. You know, do you want to say a bit about where you're teaching, what you're currently researching, what programs you're spearheading, perhaps?
Sure, yeah. So I teach at New York University, and I am an associate professor in the Department of Environmental Studies there, which is inclusive of animal studies. So studying what animals are like and how humans and other animals interact and how we can improve our interactions with animals at scale. And I also have appointments with bioethics and medical ethics and philosophy and law. And I really try to do some institutional and disciplinary bridge building because these are multi-issue and multidisciplinary problems, and it requires thinking about different issues from different methodological perspectives to address them. And yes, I direct a Center for Environmental and Animal Protection here at New York University, and this is a center that basically addresses important issues at the intersection of environmental and animal protection, like agriculture, like conservation. I also direct the Center for Mind, Ethics, and Policy. This addresses more foundational questions about non-human sentience and consciousness and agency and moral and legal and political status. And with my colleague Becca Franks, I direct the Wild Animal Welfare Program, which really focuses on how we can improve our interactions with wild animals. My focus tends to be on farmed animals, wild animals, and aquatic and invertebrates because of their importance, their neglectedness, the potential tractability of improving our effects on them. There are just so many farmed animals and even more wild animals. And of course, aquatic animals and invertebrates are particularly numerous and particularly neglected. And so I really want to target my research on those animals in particular and in order to help make progress. But I care about all of them. And I certainly spend a lot of time working on how we can improve lives for cows and pigs and even cats and dogs and so on too.
Amazing, amazing, sort of behind the scenes, but sort of not behind the scenes. But we'll try to put the links to all of those places and projects and books and things in the notes here. And I just have a couple more questions. I know to round out our conversation, and I know we'll wrap
Mhm.
up in a bit. But
Yeah.
um, what has been your most sacred or profound or memorable? I ask this of everyone. Memorable direct experience with an animal. Could be a
Hmm.
companion animal, could be a farmed animal, whatever comes to mind that you had a standout direct experience with.
Yeah, very good question. I am racking my brain to come up with an interesting answer because, of course, the only answer that immediately occurs to me is my now 12-year-long relationship with my dog, Smokey. I think, in the spirit of honesty, I am just going to have to give you that answer. So my ex-partner and I started fostering Smokey. He was born in West Virginia and then came to New York City, and we started fostering him in fall 2012. And a day or so after we started fostering him, Hurricane Sandy hit New York City. And so we had to go from apartment to apartment and sleep on couches with this 11-month-old, 80-pound boxer mix who we were fostering. Of course, we all fell in love and adopted him after that. And then he just has been in our lives ever since, is now 13 years old and still doing pretty well, and is just my most significant relationship in my adult life, and my partner will be the first to acknowledge that Smokey comes first. And actually, I dedicated my book to him. I also dedicated the only tattoo I have to him. So I would just say that my ongoing relationship with him has reminded me of how strange and subtle and interesting non-human minds and lives are. And anytime I think about, for example, insects and wild animals, I just remember that if only I interacted with them on a daily basis as much as I do with Smokey, and if they had evolved to interact with
Yeah.
humans in the same kind of way that dogs have, then I would appreciate the subtleties of their individual personalities in the same kind of way. And the mere fact that I'm not personally able to appreciate the subtleties of the personalities of each and every insect and wild animal and so on does not mean that they are not there. And I just try to hold on to that when I interact with Smokey.
Yeah, absolutely. Even though it's this seemingly sort of hypothetical, but it's not. It's translatable to every animal. What you just described, the relationship, it's a real relationship. It's a relationship like any other relationship, and no different in every single way that matters. And I agree, knowing the relationships I have with the folks the furry folks I share, my home with. It's sort of indescribable and so different and yet so similar to our human to human relationships, and they teach us so much just by being, and it's just beautiful and sacred and pure, these relationships.
Mhm.
So yeah, I love that, and it really ties in well with our conversation, because if anybody asks us, does your companion animal matter? We say, are you kidding me? Are you even asking me
Of
that
course they
question?
do. Yeah.
Should they be considered morally? Yeah. Like, do you need, right? So just the idea of translating that into, what if everybody lived with an animal? And what
Yeah.
if we could somehow combine ourselves in such a way that we live all together harmonious and all think of ourselves that way? It would be certainly a different world for us and for them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you for sharing that. So I think my final question then is what I ask: what message of inspiration and hope can you give to the next generation of animal activists and advocates?
Well, I can say that what we said before really is true, that there are signs that support hope and signs that support despair, and they are both part of the picture. When COVID hit, for example, we did reckon with how animal agriculture, animal farming of various kinds, harms animals and contributes to the spread of diseases. People now are reckoning with how animal agriculture, animal farming of various kinds, harms animals and contributes to climate change and other environmental harms. Now, we have also not reckoned with that enough, right? We have that self-interest in us, but we also have that altruism in us. And in times of abundance with greater capacity, we have demonstrated more altruism and a greater willingness to accept information and arguments in support of animal welfare and animal rights, for example. And so I think that might not support just full hope and full optimism, but we are also not justified in having full despair and full pessimism. The reality is that change is possible but hard, and that means that we are entitled to hope if we work hard to earn hope. and so I would not invite listeners to walk away just holding out hope for no good reason. But I would invite them to walk away thinking humans are complicated, societies are complicated. If we work hard and if we get lucky, we have demonstrated the capacity to make remarkable progress. And we do have the capacity to make remarkable progress from here. We just have to keep working hard and we have to get a little bit lucky. But I am holding out hope that we will make progress as long as we just are thoughtful and strategic and dedicated. And I think that is all we can do. And then we just have to do everything we can and let it play out and see what happens.
I love that. I love that. That it makes it more doable. Again, we all have room for growth, right? And let's focus on just sitting within ourselves and cultivating altruism, cultivating empathy, cultivating compassion. Even if you already consider yourself to be those, to up level that, to take it to a whole other expanded level and to evolve. So those are beautiful words. And, so as we wrap up, I want to mention the moral circle again. Who matters, what matters, and why. And I love that subtitle so much. And your other books, Saving Animals, Saving Ourselves, and Food, Animals, and the Environment, an Ethical Approach. And there was also with the chimpanzees, Chimpanzee Rights, the Philosopher's Brief. I don't know if you want to mention any other of your works, but please read Jeff's works. It's monumentally important, forward-thinking material. Jeff, thank you on behalf of animals and for your contributions and efforts toward animal justice. And thank you for joining us on the Animal Liberation Hour.
Well, thank you so much, Michelle, for you and your companion there for hosting me. And thanks to everybody for tuning in. I really appreciate it.
Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jeff Sebo and that you're ready to expand your own moral circle, because non-human animals are capable of suffering and have interests that deserve consideration, just like us. If you enjoy the Animal Liberation Hour and would like to support our work, please consider joining AAC's Patreon. Even as little as $2 a month goes a long way in helping us expand our reach and increase our impact. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, where you can keep up with the podcast as well as everything AAC. You can sign up for a free mentor to help you with your activism at animalactivismcollective.com. Our work extends beyond mentorship to include collaborations and mutual support with other grassroots animal rights groups. So reach out to us to become part of the AAC community. Here's a reminder. The animals need you. Show up, speak up, and don't give up. Until next time, this is AAC signing off.